Welcome. Before we begin, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because stories like this connect people from all over the world through a shared sense of mystery and truth. This is not just another legend. This story comes from deep historical research, pieced together from forgotten records, witness accounts, and disturbing patterns that many tried to erase. A lot of time and effort goes into uncovering these true and terrifying realities, so if you appreciate real stories told with honesty and depth, make sure to subscribe and become part of those who seek the truth behind the darkness. Now, prepare yourself for the chilling story of the slave no one could catch, and the terrifying fate of every man who pursued him. The day he arrived, no one paid much attention at first. To the traders, he was just another exhausted body among many, chained, silent, and covered in the dust of a long, merciless journey. His clothes were torn, his skin marked by bruises both old and fresh, and his eyes stayed fixed on the ground as if he refused to acknowledge the world around him. The men who unloaded him spoke casually, laughing, arguing, treating the moment like routine business. But one of them would later swear there was something different about him. Something deeply unsettling. He never cried out, not once. While others begged for water or whispered prayers under their breath, he remained completely silent. Even when the chains cut into his wrists and ankles, even when he stumbled and was dragged forward, he made no sound. It was not weakness. It was not submission. It was something else entirely, the kind of silence that feels heavy. The kind that makes people uncomfortable without knowing why. The overseer noticed it immediately. He had seen thousands of slaves pass through those gates, and fear was always the same. It showed in trembling hands, darting eyes, nervous breathing. But this one had none of those signs. His breathing was slow and steady. His face was calm. And when he finally lifted his head for the first time, his eyes did not look confused or afraid. They looked aware, observant, calculating. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The overseer felt a strange chill crawl up his spine, a feeling he could not explain. It was as if he was not looking at someone broken, but someone waiting, watching. Learning, he quickly looked away, brushing off the feeling as foolishness. After all, this was just another slave. Just another man stripped of everything. Or so he told himself. The other slaves kept their distance from him that first night. They whispered quietly among themselves, glancing in his direction when they thought he wasn't looking. Some believed he had lost his mind from the horrors he had endured. Others believed he was hiding something. They could sense it in the way he sat perfectly still, his back straight, his eyes open long after everyone else had fallen asleep. One of them tried to speak to him. A simple question. Asking his name, asking where he came from. But the silent slave did not respond. He didn't even turn his head. It was as if he existed in his own world, separate from everyone else. The man who asked the question would later say that the silence felt wrong. Not empty, but full of thoughts he could not hear. Over the next few days, the masters began to notice strange things. He learned tasks faster than anyone else. He never needed instructions repeated. He watched carefully, memorizing every detail, every routine, every weakness. He never resisted, never argued, never made mistakes. It was as if he was preparing for something no one else could see. One night, a guard claimed he saw him standing awake while everyone else slept, staring out into the darkness beyond the fields. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there, watching the trees, watching the horizon. The guard shouted at him, demanding he return to his place. Slowly, he obeyed without a word. But the guard could not forget the look in his eyes. It was not the look of a prisoner. It was the look of someone who was waiting for the right moment. From the moment he arrived, nothing about him made sense. He did not behave like the others. He did not break like the others. And deep down, though none of them would admit it, the masters began to feel something they had never felt before. Not control, not confidence, but unease. Because somewhere behind that silence, behind those calm, watchful eyes, was a mind they did not understand. And soon, they would learn just how dangerous that truly was. At first, the masters believed his silence meant obedience. They saw the way he followed orders without hesitation, the way he never argued or showed anger, and they mistook it for submission. But over time, they began to notice something unsettling beneath his calm exterior. He wasn't simply obeying, he was observing. His eyes moved constantly, watching every movement, every gesture, every routine. It was as if he was studying the world around him, quietly collecting knowledge no one realized he was taking. He learned faster than anyone they had ever seen. Tasks that took others weeks to understand, he mastered in days. He knew exactly when to move, when to stop, and how to avoid punishment. He never asked questions, yet he seemed to know everything. The overseer once gave him a complex task, meant to break his spirit, expecting him to fail like the others. Instead, he completed it perfectly on the first attempt. That was the first moment the overseer felt something he could not explain, unease. The other slaves began to notice it too. He never wasted energy. While others worked harder out of fear, he worked smarter. He conserved his strength, moving only when necessary. He never panicked, even under pressure. When the overseer shouted or raised his whip, most flinched instinctively. But he did not. He reacted only enough to avoid harm, nothing more. It was controlled, intentional, calculated. At night, when everyone else slept from exhaustion, he often remained awake. Some slaves pretended to sleep and watched him carefully. They saw his eyes open in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. The footsteps of guards, the distant creaking of doors, the rustling of trees outside. It was as if his mind never rested, as if he was mapping the world around him piece by piece. One evening, a slave accidentally dropped a tool near him, creating a loud noise that startled everyone. The guards immediately turned, suspicious and angry, but before they could react violently, he calmly stepped forward and picked up the tool, handing it back without hesitation. His timing was perfect. His movement redirected their attention instantly. The situation dissolved before it could escalate. It was a small moment, but those who saw it understood. He was always aware, always thinking ahead. The overseer began testing him, giving him unpredictable orders, changing routines without warning, trying to confuse him. But it never worked. He adapted instantly. He never looked surprised. He never hesitated. It was as if he expected chaos and was prepared for it. This made the overseer uncomfortable. He preferred slaves who were predictable, broken, easy to control. But this one was none of those things. Rumors quietly spread among the workers. Some believed he had been a warrior before his capture. Others believed he had escaped before and been recaptured. A few even whispered that he could see things others could not. They spoke in hushed voices, careful not to let the guards hear, because even speaking about him created a strange feeling of danger. One guard claimed he tried to sneak up on him from behind as a test. He moved silently, carefully, certain he would not be noticed. But just before he could reach him, the silent slave turned his head slightly. Not fully, just enough to show he knew. The guard froze. He had made no sound. Yet somehow he had been detected. The guard said nothing, but he never tried it again. Slowly, without anyone realizing it, the masters began to feel watched. Not physically threatened, but mentally exposed. They could not predict him. They could not read him. And deep inside, a terrifying thought began to grow in their minds. This was not a man who had been broken. This was a man who was waiting, preparing, and whatever he was preparing for, they feared the moment it would finally begin. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came on a cold morning when the guards noticed an empty space where he should have been. At first, they assumed he had been moved or reassigned, but as they checked the sleeping quarters, a slow realization spread among them. His chains were still there, lying on the ground, unbroken, unlocked, as if he had simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. Panic did not come immediately. Instead, there was confusion. Guards argued with one another, blaming each other for negligence. One swore he had checked the locks personally the night before. Another claimed he had seen him lying still only hours earlier. None of it made sense. There were no signs of struggle. No noise had been reported. No alarm had been raised. It was as if he had disappeared without disturbing the world around him. The overseer quickly organized a search. Men spread across the fields, checking the nearby woods, the riverbanks, and the dirt roads leading away from the property. They expected to find footprints, broken branches, or any sign of a desperate escape. But there was nothing. The ground remained undisturbed. The trees stood silent. Even the dogs struggled to find a scent worth following. What disturbed them most was the timing. The guards had been awake, watching, patrolling, and yet somehow he had escaped in the narrow space between their attention. It wasn't luck. It wasn't desperation. It felt planned, precise, as if he had studied their routines long enough to find the one moment when no one was truly watching. Hours passed, and frustration turned into anger. The overseer shouted orders, threatening punishment for anyone who failed to find him. Horses were brought in, and experienced trackers were sent deeper into the wilderness. These were men who had hunted fugitives before. Men who rarely failed. They followed faint impressions in the soil, subtle disturbances invisible to ordinary eyes. For a moment, it seemed they had found his trail. But then the trail ended, abruptly, without explanation. The footprints stopped in the middle of open ground, with no clear direction forward. The trackers circled the area repeatedly, searching for continuation, but there was none. It was as if he had vanished into the air itself. Even the most experienced among them could not explain it. As the sun began to set, An uneasy silence fell over the search party. This was no longer a simple escape. It was something they did not understand. One tracker quietly admitted he had never seen anything like it before. Another refused to continue, claiming something about the situation felt wrong. The overseer dismissed their fears, but deep down, even he felt it. That night, the property felt different. The guards were more alert. The shadows seemed deeper. Every sound in the distance made them tense. They knew he was out there somewhere, watching, waiting, and the fact that he had escaped so cleanly, so perfectly, made them question everything they thought they controlled. For the other slaves, the escape became an instant legend. They whispered about it in secret, their voices filled with both hope and fear. No one had ever escaped like that before. No one had ever disappeared without a trace. It was as if he had never been there at all. But they knew he had been. And now he was free. What none of them realized at that moment was that this was only the beginning. His escape was not just an act of freedom. It was the first move in something far greater. And soon, the men who believed they could hunt him down would learn a terrifying truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the ones being led into the unknown. The first man who volunteered to hunt him was known for his confidence. He was not just a guard, but a tracker with years of experience finding escaped slaves in forests, swamps, and mountains. He had built his reputation on never failing. When he heard about the escape, he laughed, dismissing the fear spreading among the others. To him, this was nothing more than another fugitive who would soon be dragged back in chains. He left early in the morning, armed and prepared. He studied the ground carefully, noticing faint disturbances others had missed. A bent blade of grass, a barely visible impression in the dirt, signs invisible to untrained eyes. He followed these clues with patience, certain he was closing in. The trail led toward the dense woods beyond the property, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Hours passed as he moved deeper into the wilderness. The air grew heavier, quieter. The sounds of the outside world faded until only the forest remained. Still, he pressed forward, convinced he was close. He began to notice something strange. The trail was too clean, too deliberate. It was almost as if it was meant to be followed. By midday, he reached a small clearing. The footprints stopped there. He searched the area, scanning every direction, expecting to find the continuation of the trail. But there was nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed soil, just silence. He stood still, listening, feeling an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his chest. Uncertainty. He called out, his voice firm but cautious, demanding the fugitive reveal himself. His words disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the forest. There was no answer, no movement, no sound. Yet he could not shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. That someone, somewhere, was watching him. Back at the property, the men waited for his return. They expected him by nightfall. He was too skilled to fail, too experienced to get lost. But as the sun disappeared and darkness took hold, he did not come back. At first, they assumed he had chosen to continue the hunt overnight. It was not unusual for him to push himself further than others. By morning, concern began to grow. A second group was sent to find him. They followed his trail easily at first, his movements confident and direct. But when they reached the clearing, they found nothing. No sign of struggle, no dropped weapon, no footprints leading away. He had simply vanished. Just like the man he was hunting. The men searched the area for hours, calling his name, spreading out through the trees. But the forest gave them nothing. No answers, no clues. It was as if both men had been erased from the world. The hunters returned with empty hands, their confidence shaken, their voices quieter than before. Word of his disappearance spread quickly. The man who never failed had failed. The hunter had become the missing. Fear began to replace arrogance. The masters who once believed they controlled everything now faced something they could not explain. Something they could not see. From that moment on, the hunt was no longer simple. It was no longer certain. Because somewhere in the wilderness was a man who had escaped without a trace, and now, the first person who tried to bring him back had disappeared forever. After the first hunter disappeared, the atmosphere among the slave owners and guards changed completely. What had once been seen as a routine escape was now something far more disturbing. The confidence that once defined them was replaced with quiet tension. They no longer spoke of the fugitive with anger, but with unease. His name was rarely mentioned, and when it was, voices dropped to whispers, as if saying it too loudly might invite something unwanted. The masters refused to show fear openly, but their actions betrayed them. They doubled the number of guards at night. Patrols became more frequent, more cautious. Men who once walked alone now moved in groups. Lanterns burned longer into the night, pushing back the darkness that suddenly felt deeper than before. They told themselves it was just precaution, but deep down, they were unsettled. The remaining hunters were no longer eager to volunteer. The disappearance of the first tracker had shaken them deeply. He had been the best among them, a man who knew the wilderness better than anyone. If he could vanish without leaving a trace, what chance did the others have? Some refused outright, inventing excuses. Others agreed reluctantly, driven more by fear of punishment than confidence in success. Rumors began to spread, growing more terrifying with each retelling. Some claimed the fugitive had knowledge of the land that went beyond ordinary understanding. Others whispered that he had been trained long before his capture, that he knew how to survive, how to hide, how to turn the hunt against those who pursued him. No one knew the truth, but the uncertainty itself became a source of fear. Even the guards who remained on the property began to feel watched. At night, they reported hearing faint movements beyond the tree line. Soft sounds that disappeared when investigated. A shadow between the trees that vanished when approached. Nothing could be proven, but the feeling lingered, the sense that he was still nearby, still aware. One guard swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the fields late one night. He described it as still and silent, barely visible in the darkness. When he called out, the figure did not respond. When he stepped forward, it was gone. The other guards dismissed his story, but the fear in his voice was undeniable. He had seen something. Or at least he believed he had. Sleep became difficult for many of them. Every sound felt like a warning. Every shadow felt like a presence. The forest, which had once been familiar and harmless, now felt alive with something unknown. The men who once believed themselves to be the hunters now felt exposed, vulnerable in ways they had never experienced before. The masters grew more desperate. They offered rewards, promised money, land, and protection to anyone who could find him. But fewer and fewer men were willing to try. The risk was no longer worth the reward. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too much uncertainty surrounded the situation. Slowly, a terrifying realization began to take hold in their minds. This was no longer a simple matter of capturing a runaway slave. This was something else entirely. Something they did not understand. And somewhere out there, hidden beyond their reach, was the man who had turned their certainty into fear and their hunt into something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Fully expand detailless, no heading 9, paragraph keynote 6. The first abandoned camp was discovered by accident. A group of hunters, sent to search deeper into the wilderness, stumbled upon it near the edge of a dry riverbed. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Bedrolls were laid out. Supplies were stacked neatly. A fire pit sat in the center, its ashes cold and undisturbed. But there was no one there, not a single person. It was as if the men had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. The hunters approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone would answer. Their voices echoed through the trees, but the forest remained silent. They examined the ground, expecting to find signs of struggle or movement. But the soil showed no clear footprints leading away, no evidence of panic, no indication that the men had fled. It made no sense. Experienced hunters did not abandon their camps without reason. One of them noticed something unsettling. The weapons were still there. Rifles leaned against a log untouched. Knives lay beside sleeping blankets. No hunter would willingly leave behind his weapon, especially in unfamiliar territory. It was against instinct, against survival itself. This detail made the discovery far more disturbing than any sign of violence would have. As they continued searching the area, they found uneaten food, still preserved as if it had been left only hours ago. A metal cup sat beside the fire pit, half full of water. Everything suggested the men had intended to stay. There was no preparation for departure, no packed supplies, no signs of planning to move, just sudden, unexplained absence. One hunter began to feel a growing sense of dread. He described the feeling as being watched from somewhere beyond sight. He turned suddenly, scanning the trees, expecting to see movement. But there was nothing, only endless rows of silent trunks stretching into darkness. The others felt it too, but said nothing, admitting fear would make it real. They searched the surrounding area for hours, spreading out, calling names, hoping for any sign of life. But the forest gave them nothing. No bodies, no footprints, no broken branches. It was as if the missing men had been erased, completely, without leaving a single trace behind. When they returned to report what they had found, their voices were quieter than before. The masters listened carefully, their expressions tense. This was not the disappearance of one man. This was something larger. A group of trained hunters had vanished without explanation, and the only connection between all of it was the same escaped slave. More camps were discovered in the following days, each one identical in its silence, equipment left behind, fires extinguished, no signs of struggle, no signs of escape, just emptiness. Each discovery added to the growing fear that something beyond their understanding was happening in the wilderness. By now, no one spoke confidently about capturing him anymore. The hunt had turned into something else entirely. The forest had become a place of mystery and dread, and the abandoned camps stood as silent proof that those who entered in search of him were not guaranteed to return. By now, the rumors had spread far beyond the property. What began as whispers among slaves and guards had grown into something larger, something that reached nearby plantations, small towns, and traveling traders. Everyone had heard some version of the story: the slave who escaped, the hunters who vanished, the camps left behind without explanation. But the most disturbing part was not just that he had escaped. It was that he always seemed to be one step ahead. Men who joined the hunt began to notice strange patterns. Every time they planned a search route, something would go wrong. They would arrive at a location only to find signs that someone had already been there, watching, waiting, and leaving before they arrived. Sometimes it was faint footprints near their own camps. Sometimes it was supplies that had been slightly moved. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was destroyed. Just small changes, as if to send a message. One hunter reported waking up in the middle of the night with a sudden feeling he could not explain. The fire beside him had burned low, and the forest was silent. But something felt wrong. He scanned the darkness and noticed footprints at the edge of their camp. Fresh footprints. They had not been there before. Someone had approached while they slept. Someone had stood close enough to watch them, and then walked away. Fear began to replace reason. The hunters started to believe they were no longer tracking him. He was tracking them. He knew their movements before they made them. He knew their plans before they acted. Every step they took into the wilderness felt like stepping into something carefully prepared, something controlled by a mind they could not predict. The masters tried to maintain order, insisting that he was just a man, just a fugitive. They refused to accept the idea that he could outthink them so completely. But their orders grew more desperate. They changed strategies repeatedly, sending different groups along unpredictable routes. Yet it made no difference. Each time, they found nothing. Or worse, they found signs that he had already passed through. One group discovered footprints circling their camp, forming a wide, slow circle around where they had slept. The prints never came too close, but they never moved too far away either. It was as if he had been observing them for hours, studying their behavior, learning their weaknesses. The realization left them deeply shaken. They had not seen him. They had not heard him. But he had been there. Even the most skeptical men began to lose confidence. They could not explain how he moved without being detected, how he predicted their actions so perfectly, how he vanished whenever they came close. It was as if he understood them better than they understood themselves, as if he could see the hunt unfolding before it even began. Some began to believe he had lived in wilderness before his capture, that he knew how to survive in ways they never could. Others believed something darker, something harder to explain. They believed he had become something else entirely, not just a man running for freedom, but a presence within the forest itself. The longer he remained free, the stronger his legend grew. He was no longer just an escaped slave. He had become a shadow in their minds, a figure who could see without being seen, A mind that stayed one step ahead of every trap, every hunter, every plan. And with each passing day, the terrifying truth became clearer. They were not chasing him anymore. They were walking exactly where he wanted them to go. The final massive hunt began with a sense of urgency that none of the previous attempts had carried. The masters had grown desperate. They could no longer tolerate the embarrassment, the fear, or the unknown. Men from neighboring plantations, experienced hunters, and even mercenaries were brought in. They carried weapons, ropes, and packs filled with provisions. Their orders were simple: find him, bring him back. In this once and for all. From the very start, the hunters felt the tension in the air. Every man walked cautiously, scanning the dense woods, their ears straining for the slightest sound. They spread out in lines, covering every inch of the forest in a coordinated effort that should have been foolproof. Yet, despite their numbers and experience, a quiet unease settled over the group. No one admitted it, but they all knew something was different this time. Within hours, the first signs appeared. Footprints, carefully spaced, deliberate, impossible to interpret. The tracks led through marshes, over fallen logs, and across rocky clearings. Sometimes they seemed to go in one direction, only to curve back in ways that defied logic. The hunters followed them obsessively, certain they were close, yet the feeling of being watched never left them. As the day dragged on, small things began to unsettle them. A snapped branch here, a rustle of leaves there. Nothing visible, nothing tangible, yet the forest seemed alive in ways they could not explain. When they called out his name, the echoes that returned did not feel like echoes, they felt deliberate. As if someone, somewhere, was responding in silence, letting them know they were being observed. By nightfall, exhaustion set in, but the men pressed on. They camped briefly in a small clearing, attempting to rest while keeping watch. That night, several claimed to hear footsteps circling their fire, soft enough that they could not see the source. Some saw shadows shifting, just beyond the lantern light. Fear spread quickly, though they tried to maintain discipline. No one slept soundly. No one trusted the forest. The next morning, the hunters awoke to find their camp disturbed. Tools moved. Supplies shifted. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. But the subtle rearrangements were enough to send a wave of panic through the group. Whoever had done this had been inside their camp, watching them, and then vanished without leaving a trace. The realization struck hard. He had not only survived the wilderness, he had outsmarted them completely. The search resumed with renewed caution, but the forest seemed to mock them. Every path they chose seemed to circle back on itself. Every clue they thought they discovered led to nowhere. Some hunters admitted in hushed tones that it was as if the land itself had turned against them, guiding them toward traps they could not see. Fear became unbearable, but the masters demanded results. By the third day, men began disappearing. First a single hunter, then two more. Entire groups went missing within sight of others. Those who remained were terrified, yet they dared not retreat. The remaining men whispered that the fugitive was not just ahead of them. He was controlling the hunt itself, luring them into impossible situations where escape was no longer an option. When the hunt finally ended, those left behind returned with pale faces and shaking hands. They spoke of camps found abandoned, weapons left behind, and tracks that led to nowhere. None of the men who had pursued him returned with answers, and the legend was cemented. He had turned every attempt to capture him into a trap, leaving the forest empty of hunters and full of unanswered fear. From that day on, no one dared attempt the chase again. The forest belonged to him. Even after he vanished from sight, his legend refused to fade. Years passed, yet every mention of him carried the same weight of fear and awe. Travelers spoke of the silent slave who had outwitted everyone, and the tales spread across plantations, towns, and villages. Parents warned children not to wander near the woods, using his story as a cautionary tale, though none knew the full truth. The mere suggestion of his presence was enough to silence conversations and quicken heartbeats. Some claimed to have glimpsed him in fleeting moments, a shadow darting between trees, a pair of eyes reflecting lantern light in the distance, or footprints that appeared and vanished mysteriously. Each account added to the mystery, reinforcing the idea that he had become more than a man. He was a ghost in the wilderness, a presence that existed where no one else could tread, always one step ahead, always unseen. Merchants and hunters who traveled near the area reported strange experiences. Tools would go missing, supplies would shift inexplicably, and sometimes at night, faint footprints would appear outside their camps, leading nowhere. Those who followed the tracks claimed they seemed impossible, too precise, too deliberate, and almost mocking. It was as if he continued to watch the world long after his disappearance. Whispers among slaves took on a darker tone. Some said he had returned at night to silently walk through the fields, unseen by the overseers, reminding them that freedom could exist even in the most hopeless circumstances. Others claimed he left subtle signs for those brave enough to notice, a bent branch here, a mark on a tree there, as if guiding or warning them. His intelligence and cunning had become almost supernatural in legend. The masters who had once hunted him were never the same. Those who survived the hunts carried fear with them for the rest of their lives. Some refused to speak of it, while others became obsessed, haunted by the thought that he could reappear at any moment. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been shattered by a single man who refused to be controlled, a man who had turned hunters into prey. Stories even reached distant plantations, carried by traders and travelers. Some claimed that his presence influenced events beyond the immediate area. Animals acted strangely near the woods, hunters refused to enter, and crops near the forest would fail, as if the land itself was marked by his escape. The man who could not be caught had left a ripple of fear and mystery that touched everyone who came near. Generations later, the tale remained alive. Children grew up hearing about him, about the silent, cunning slave who outsmarted everyone and disappeared into the wilderness. Scholars who later examined the records found gaps, disappearances, and unexplained events that coincided with the legend. They could not confirm every detail, but the pattern was undeniable. Wherever he went, chaos followed those who tried to control him. Some claimed he became a symbol of freedom, a ghostly figure who represented defiance against cruelty and oppression. Others feared him as a predator who would strike anyone foolish enough to enter his domain. No one knew for certain if he survived for years, if he lived to old age, or if he simply vanished into myth, but his influence remained undeniable, etched into the memories of everyone who had heard his story. Ultimately, his legend became immortal. He was not just a man, nor simply a slave. He was the embodiment of cunning, patience, and survival against impossible odds. Every hunter who pursued him and disappeared became part of his story, a story that proved the power of intelligence over brute force, patience over aggression, and freedom over fear. His name lived on, whispered in shadows and forests, a reminder that some spirits, once unleashed, cannot be captured, and some minds are far too clever to ever be tamed.